Albert, prometiste que volvías a hacer aventura conmigo y encima en León y has venido.
Me lo pasé bien, tengo que volver. No me podía quedar en casa.
Nada más empezar, ya estoy feliz.
¿Sí?
Y me hiciste caso. Mira qué colorín que has metido, que te veo la camiseta por fuera, el forro amarillo así. Tú mira cómo vamos de guapines.
Elegante.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's true that the business environment seems to have been turned upside down in the last 2 or 3 years, starting with the pandemic, but not just the pandemic, with the supply chains needing to be shortened and the intrusion of really very present geopolitical risk. Globalization is fast no longer becoming the rule, and consumer spending power is under attack, and then there's war, and that brings uncertainty. And what it all comes down to is that we're learning to live in a context where our visibility is severely hampered, severely constrained. You know, maybe 10 years ago, you could be making 5-year plans without too much anxiety, but nowadays, 3 months ahead is really difficult. And ironically, if there is one constant in that whole picture, it is a pressing need, an emergency to drive the sustainability agenda. And I think that what COP26 has changed in the general public opinion is that both governments and the private sector, who are the key actors, have belatedly but completely woken up to the fact that the climate change is an emergency. And we can't just consider this to be some cosmetic adaptation, but it's something that we need to act on. And I think there's a general understanding of this. And as a result, the reason why the CEO is going to have to keep this very much as a priority is that first, regulation is going to become increasingly constraining. We see it, and it's not just about environmental regulation. It's also everything to do with the social dimension, including the initiatives around forced labor, both in America and in Europe, and in different European countries. But there's also the ecological dimension. The second reason is that investors are increasingly shifting towards becoming more demanding. So we've had this ESG movement for several years now, economic sustainability and governance, and social and governance, but it's becoming more and more well-defined. When it started, there was a little bit of a fashion buzz to it, you know, a sort of flavor of the month, but now it's becoming a genuine part of investors' expectations. And you can see money flows actually changing and being shifted away from unsustainable producers towards more sustainable producers. So there's a long way to go, but the pressure of the investor is probably the biggest pressure the CEO has. So that's going to be an enormous lever in making sustainability a priority. And then finally, there's the consumers. Now, we know consumers are very attentive to price, especially nowadays. So that's kind of a mitigating factor, but because consumers are becoming much more vocal because they're seeing the impact in their home lives, in their families, in their schools, and in their cities. And so they're shifting more slowly in their demands. It is much more slowly, but they are shifting. So all in all, the pressure for the CEO and management teams to deliver on sustainability targets is becoming unrelenting. And in fact, so much so that what we're seeing and what we think is probably a good thing is that for companies, sustainability is going to be part of their competitive edge. And that's why we're seeing people going above and beyond by announcing in advance their commitments for Scope 3 targets, their commitments for greenhouse gas emissions and science-based targets in particular. Well, I think what we can expect is that the more the leading companies and the pioneer companies, and yes, it's true, the larger companies are going to voluntarily try and stay ahead of regulation. We know that legislation is something of a blunt instrument. It's not the most effective means of making things happen. And companies who want to be able to manage this constraint in accordance with all of their other strategies and tactics are going to be taking initiatives and taking steps ahead of the game. And we're seeing it already. We've been seeing it for several years now, companies making public targets for how they're changing the sustainability of their activity, and especially the sustainability of their supply chains, because this is absolutely critical. It's the supply chains over which they have more or less visibility and more or less leverage that are becoming more and more brought into the mix. And as the number of companies, number of brands and retailers that are demanding more of their supply chains, as this number increases, so the supply chains need to fall into line because they're all overlapping. So I think what's going to happen is that the private sector is going to be taking the initiative. It already has to a certain extent. And because the leading companies are taking the initiative, then their competitors are going to have to follow. So there's always going to be leaders and followers, but one hopes that the whole sector as a result is going to have to take faster steps than just those required by regulation. Of course, there's some of that. Of course, there is. But we can see, because we work, we only work at farm level. And already the fact, and in fact, cotton farming is far more distant from a fashion brand than, for instance, a cocoa farmer or a soybean farmer is going to be from a food brand. The supply chain is much longer and much more complicated. And yet, the brands are doing everything they can to reach all the way down that supply chain to make sure that they can see and understand what the impact of demand is on the farming level, and how they can improve that and what they can do to change this. So again, it's the leading brands, it's the pioneers that are making that effort, and it's what's building their identity and also building their commitments publicly that is making the difference. So yes, of course, to a certain extent, they're passing, I wouldn't say they're passing the buck, but they are being more demanding. But this is a good thing. The one missing element in all of this is the cost. We have to get rid of this myth that sustainability is a way of saving money and reducing expenses. There is a cost to sustainability. There's a price that we're going to have to pay. And thank goodness some of the companies are biting that bullet, because all of us have to do this. And in fact, there's a high cost to low prices. And that's what the more insightful brands are beginning to realize and trying to mitigate for. They care about what's visible to them for obvious reasons. And to a certain extent, and rightly, they expect both their suppliers, their shops, and their governments to look after whatever their part of the business is. So they might not necessarily see where the raw materials are, but increasingly today, this kind of information is so freely available that yes, they are beginning to realize that their consumer, it's a very big generalization, but people are beginning to realize the impact of purchasing power on sustainability. And of course, against that, you've got the ever-present ruling of price. And I think what consumers are beginning to realize is that things like slow fashion, even slow food, and excessive consumption is not just bad for their wallets, it's also bad for the planet. But it's very slow compared to what has to be done, and the industry has to take the lead. Yes, undoubtedly. I mean, the fact is that the label organic is easy to understand. It's a concept that everybody can immediately get attached to. The challenge is that delivering real organic at scale, it has proved so far impossible to do, because it's a very complicated ambition for the farmers, for the producers. And of course, being able to trace it reliably is a second level of complication. So explaining better cotton in that context, more sustainable production, is quite a challenge, because we need to, it's not easy to grasp. But there's room for both. And we, everything that can be done to support organic, we will do, because it's obviously what everyone aspires to. The distinction between better cotton and organic is that better cotton is trying to make progressive change while we're waiting for fundamental change to be able to become realistic and at scale. It's a challenge because we can't attach a label to a shirt saying, this is better cotton. We just cannot do it. Not yet. We're working on that. But what we talk about is investing in farming. And it's really important to understand that when you look at the cotton agricultural sector, which is enormous, we're talking about several 100 million producers and their dependents, and not to mention even the supply chain. So it's a huge social angle to the better cotton story. And we're talking about investing in cotton farming, investing in better environment, in better social, in better lives for everyone. That's the story that we're putting ahead. And in fact, our aspiration is going to be that we can deliver impact. So when we talk about impact, and this is why the story is complicated, because when you go to buy a T-shirt, you're not necessarily thinking about everything that goes behind it. But what we're trying to show is that we can deliver impact on greenhouse gases, we can deliver impact on pesticides, deliver impact on water stewardship, on biodiversity, on soil health. These are all very intricate and complicated concepts, but if we underline them in an intelligent way, consumers aren't stupid. They can respond to this. And then there's the whole social dimension as well. And we're focusing on things like livelihoods, obviously, but also child labor and forced labor and women's empowerment. And all of these concepts are the ones that we need to be able to vehicle. So it's a bit of a challenge. It's not as simple as organic, but at least we can do it at scale. Yeah, well, no, recycled materials are an absolute must. It's essential that they become part of the mix. Unfortunately, I don't think our technology is such that it can really deliver a lot of recyclable, enough of volumes to really make a change. And at the same time, we have to remember, as I mentioned, the hundreds of millions of people who are dependent on cotton farming. And cotton, at the end of the day, can be a renewable resource. So there's no reason why the two shouldn't coexist. Renewable production on the one hand and circularity and recycling on the other. And in fact, they're probably going to become essential partners in the future, one hopes. Yes, it is feasible already today, but it's a major challenge. It's a major challenge because there's no traceability. It's a bit like if you turn on a tap, where is that water coming from? Or if you plug in an appliance to the wall, you don't know where the electricity is being produced. Well, cotton is sort of similar to that, but traceability is becoming more and more within reach, especially with new technologies and new abilities to manage data. The danger is, and there is a real risk here, that the higher end, the world-class, high-tech, industrialized farming sector is going to be able to move to traceability much quicker than anyone else. And they probably are responsible for something like 2/3 of the world's cotton, maybe even more than that. So it's going to be very tempting to bring into a traceable format all of those the industrialized part of farming. And of course, the danger is that we leave behind the 99% of cotton farmers who are smallholders or migrant workers or temporary workers and whose livelihood depends on cotton farming, but the volumes are tiny. So that is, in fact, going to be our challenge, is going to be to make sure that we can deliver traceability for visibility for the brands, because that's what they need. They need the visibility across the board, but it won't happen overnight. And in fact, the whole sector is not going to go over to traceability overnight, because it's incredibly complex and it's going to need a lot of changes of the behavior for tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of companies. But what's interesting, and I'm sorry, I'm going on a bit, but this is important. What's interesting is our research shows that the supply chain And we have a good view on the supply chain, even though all of our work is at field level, because we trace all the transactions, we have a good view of the supply chain. And the supply chain, and our research is telling us that the supply chain is it's not quite ready for this, but it's expecting it. And the best estimate is that something like 3/4 of companies believe that they can probably move over partially or wholly to traceability within 2 or 3 years. I think it's going to be inevitable. It's not going to be the whole sector, but it's going to bring substantial segments of the sector, starting with the high-end ones, are going to happen very soon. Okay, it's a good question. Well, it's important to look at it from the other point of view as well, is what is the reputational risk of not investing in the right kinds of cotton? So here we go. This is a distinguish. Yes, we must continue to invest in cotton, but we need to continue to invest in more renewable, more sustainable cotton. And that is the key thing. And that, in fact, is Better Cotton's mission. Is ultimately our dream is that the whole sector is going to become more sustainable. And of course, we don't want to perpetuate the bad practices. And there are awful practices in environmental terms and in social terms around the world in cotton production. We're talking about 70 or 80 countries. It's very difficult to generalize. Each territory is different, but there are a lot of practices that need changing. But what's good is that we have the knowledge and the understanding of how to change them. What we now need is the drive and the commitment of the brands. And fortunately, the brands are our understanding, the way we see things, is that they're continuing to invest massively in more sustainable production. So yes, there is undoubtedly a role for it. And in fact, it's necessary because so many livelihoods depend on it. Okay, obviously very difficult to predict, but what we think we should be aiming for, and I think, there's probably a consensus around the world because of the climate emergency, that there should be no more drawing down of fossil fuels. Now, 2030 is a little bit of a short-term goal, but 20 years, that's becoming much more realistic. At least that we can make a substantial impact on that. And so no more drawing down of fossil fuels. All raw materials by then have got to be renewable or recyclable, or recycled and recyclable, if you see what I mean. And then at the same time, we have to make sure that production by then, and this is feasible in a 20-year framework, that the GHG emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, are reduced to a net zero or even to carbon sequestration, because the agricultural research seems to indicate that regenerative farming can lead to more carbon sequestration and a positive impact on the climate. So it's a lot of things to bring together. It seems like a dream, but 20 years is a long enough time frame to be able to achieve this. And more importantly, we have the know-how and we have the ability to reach it. The important thing is that governments, the public sector, and the private sector together need to work together and harness all our resources in order to be able to achieve it. But that's our dream, and a world in which all cotton farming is sustainable and good for the people who produce it. I think it's within reach.
Albert, prometiste que volvías a hacer aventura conmigo y encima en León y has venido.
Me lo pasé bien, tengo que volver. No me podía quedar en casa.
Nada más empezar, ya estoy feliz.
¿Sí?
Y me hiciste caso. Mira qué colorín que has metido, que te veo la camiseta por fuera, el forro amarillo así. Tú mira cómo vamos de guapines.
Elegante.